Most developers understand the importance of having good quality tests, but I'm yet to meet one who actually enjoys writing them. Let me show you a way that you can quickly write tests which cover far more with less code. So here I have a very simple user account service with a create method, and that takes a command which has a first name and a last name property. I then take those properties to create a user account entity, and I'm saving that to the database. I'm then returning that user account back to the caller. So it's a very, very simple method as an example of something that we might write unit tests for on a daily basis. So here I have an example of the sort of unit tests that you might already write for this type of method. So here I have an example of where I'm setting the command, which has the first and last name set. I'm then passing that through to the user account service create method, is the one we just looked at. And then after that, I'm using fluent assertions to check that the first name on the account matches the name that I passed through on the command. And if you're following the rule of only having one assertion per test, then you might have several of these to check various things. So for example, I have another one here to check the last name is set correctly. Now, that's all well and good, and they're fairly clean and it works, but it's quite time consuming. And as I mentioned before, it's something that most developers don't really enjoy writing. And one of the other downfalls to this type of approach is that if I was to then come and add a new feature, so for example, if I was to add to the user account entity a display name that should be the combination of the first and last name, then these tests would still run and pass, but there would be nothing that now checks that new property unless I, as the developer, remember to go in and create a new test for that new property, which often doesn't happen. But what if I was to tell you that there is a way where you can write less code that covers the same things as this and other things that you might not have even thought about, as well as new features that you might add later without needing to know what those are? And that's where snapshot testing comes in. So snapshot testing is not a new type of testing. We would still write unit and integration tests, but it is a different way of performing the assertion. And by performing the assertion in a different way, you'll be surprised at just how much you can cover with less code. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's use this example test here, the first name check, and we're going to turn this into a snapshot test. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new NuGet package to my project, and that's going to be the verify package. So I'm going to go to NuGet and I'm going to look for the verify package. And since I'm using XUnit, I'm going to install that one. But you can see that there's also options for NUnit, MSTest, and lots of others. So I'm going to add in XUnit. So now that verify is installed into our project, I'm going to remove this assertion at the bottom of the test, and instead I'm going to call await, and then I'm going to call verify. Verify is a method that comes from the package that we just installed. And what we need to do is then pass in the thing that we want to verify. So in this case, I want to verify the response that came back from the account service, which in our case is the account object. So I'm going to pass that in to verify. So now what we're going to do is we're going to run this test. And the first time we run it, it is going to fail. Now, you might be wondering, how is this magical verify method going to work? And that's where the beauty of snapshot testing comes in. So the first time that we run the test, verify doesn't know what should be the correct answer. So it doesn't know, in this case, what the account object should actually look like. So it's going to fail. And it's going to bring up this diff window. So in this case, on the left-hand side, I can see the actual entity that was passed into verify on this occasion, so what the result was of this particular test. And on the right-hand side, I can see what verify knows to be the correct answer currently, which is empty. And that's why it's brought up the diff window, because they don't match. So on the left-hand side, I can actually see a JSON serialized version of the object that I passed in to verify. So in this case, it was the account object. So I can see that on the account object that there were these properties, the ID, the first name, and so on. And I can see that the ID was a GUID. I can see the first name was sharp, the last name was overflow. that there was a created at date set, and that the isActive was set to true. So bearing in mind this is just one test, which used to just check if the first name was set to sharp, it's now checking that, but it's also checking the last name, it's checking the date, the isActive property, and everything else that might also be on there. So looking at the left-hand side, I can see that that looks right to me. That's how I would expect it to be. So I'm going to move that over to the right-hand side and make that my verified version for this test. Now, when I close it and I rerun that test again, this time it's going to check the result that it receives against the one that I've confirmed to be verified, and it's now passing. So now what we can actually do is remove this other test for the last name because it's not needed anymore, because that's now covered in just this one test. But also those other properties that I hadn't written a test for example, does the isActive property get set to true, is also now covered in this test without me having to even think about it. And that's where the power and beauty of snapshot testing comes in. Just quickly, if you are getting any value from the videos that I'm posting, please do subscribe to the channel and like this video. It really helps me out and allows me to continue to grow and produce more content like this for you in the future. Thank you. So now back over in our user account service, let's say sometime in the future, we decide to add a new property to the user account entity. So in this case, I'm going to add a display name property. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that equals to the first and the last name concatenated together with a space in between them. So that's a new thing that I've added to the user account. And if we go back to our original unit test that we had, we know that those would have still passed, but we wouldn't have anything to cover this new property. However, with snapshot testing, we will. So if we go back over now to our user account service tests, we still only have this one method. And if we run it this time, you'll find that it will fail. And it's going to fail because something has changed. So without me having to write anything into the test about something that might happen in the future, not only did we get those extra things tested, which we didn't have before, we also now get this protection that if anything was to change, including things being added, we will see that as well. And notice how when the diff windows comes up, we can actually visually see what it is that's changed. Whereas a lot of times when tests fail, there's some sort of cryptic error message and we don't really know what it is that's actually going wrong. Here, I can clearly see that a new property called display name has appeared and that it's set to sharp overflow. And that's exactly what I expected it to be. So I'm going to move that over to the verified side on the right-hand side. And that's now accepted to be the new verified version for this particular test. So next time that I run it, it will now pass. And it must always have that display name property for it to pass again in the future. So very quickly, I can see what's changed and I can quickly update my tests to cover things as my project grows. So I hope you can see the benefit in having these snapshot tests and how you can cover so much more without even thinking about it. So now let me go into a little bit about the setup of Verify and how you can configure Verify to work with some of the most common use cases. So although it did work straight out of the box, there are some settings that you can configure and that you'll likely run up against quite quickly. So one of the first things to consider is how these verified versions of your tests are stored and shared with any of your colleagues. So for example, if somebody else was to pull down the same code and run it on their machine, they would need to know what the verified version of the test would be in order for this to work. And the way that Verify does that is that it saves a verified text file next to the test. So if we look at the project solution here, we can see that there is our user account service tests file, but there's also this new text file that has the name of the class, then the name of the test, and then it ends in .verified.txt. And if we have a look at that, you can see that it's the verified version that we accepted over to the right-hand side in the diff window before. So this is how Verified saves the verified version of each test, and this is where it will look next time that you run that test. So you want to ensure that these files are checked into your source control And as long as they have the matching name, it will work on somebody else's machine as well. Now, you might be thinking that this might get messy quite quickly with all these different files, but there is something you can do to keep them in a little bit more order. So let's go back over to our test. And in the constructor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new instance of verify settings. So I'm going to say new var settings equals new verify settings. And on the settings, I'm going to say use directory, and this will then specify where to keep those files. So I'm going to just call this snapshots like this, but you can call it whatever you want. And then the important thing will be is to pass these settings through to the verify method every time that you use it. So you could have different settings for different tests. It depends on your requirements. So actually, I'm going to change this to be a field, and then I'm going to pass that in as the second argument to the verify call. So I'm going to pass that through as settings. So now if I run that test again, you'll see that it will fail because now it's looking in a different location to before. So it's no longer seeing that file that we had before as our verified file. So I'm going to accept this over as our verified, and I'm going to close that and run it again, and it will then pass. And if we have a look, you can see in the Solution Explorer that there is now a folder called Snapshots, and the file is in there. So I'm now going to delete the old one because we've moved that one. And let's actually have a look at these. And you can see there's two. So there's a received version and there's a verified version. So the received version is the version on the left-hand side of the diff window. And that's the version that we received the last time that we ran the test. So the one we ran just now. And the verified is that second version on the right-hand side, which is the true version, how it should look. Now, it's only the verified files that we actually want to check in. You don't need to check in the received files. So if you're using something like Git, you'll want to add a rule to that to ensure that it doesn't check in the received files. There are a few things built into Verify that you can use to ensure that things are configured correctly. So let's go over to the project. I'm going to right click and add a class, and I'm going to call this Verify Checks. And in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a unit test just like the others. So I'm going to call this just run. You can call that whatever you want. And then I'm going to call verify xunit, verify checks, and then I'm going to call run, which is basically a test method that's built into verify. So I'm just wrapping that in a typical unit test. And therefore I need to add the fact attribute because I'm using xunit, and I'm going to actually return the result of that. So now it's a unit test like any other, but it runs that verified check. And if I run that, what it will do is it will go through and make sure that I have everything configured correctly to be using verify. And one of the things that it will check is to make sure that your git ignore file, if you're using Git, is set up correctly to ignore those received files. Now, I already have mine set up correctly, but I'm going to change mine so that I no longer have those entries in there. And then I'm going to run this verify check test again. And now you can see that that test is actually failing. And what it's actually telling us is that the git ignore file doesn't contain the settings for verify. So we can copy that from here and we can go over to our git ignore file, and I can just add those in to the bottom down here. And then if we run that test again, we can see that it passes. So it's worth having this check added in as one of your unit tests, just to ensure that everything is set up correctly. That will now ignore those received files and just checking the verified files so that your colleagues and you on another machine will be able to run the snapshot tests correctly. Another class that's worth setting up in your code, if you're going to use verify, is to add a verify setup class. So in here, this is what will run at the beginning before the verify tests run, and this will configure things to work in the way that you want them to. So what I'm going to add in here is a static initialize method, And then I'm going to add the module initializer attribute, and that will ensure that this runs at the beginning. So I'm then going to call verifier settings, and then I'm going to call initialize plugins. And I'm then going to say diff tools dot use order. And then in my case, I'm using Rider as my IDE. So I just want to ensure that when that diff window pops up, that it uses my diff window that's built into Rider. So I'm going to say diff tool.rider. And you can then say comma and specify others in case that one isn't installed. And you can see that it supports a variety of different diff windows, such as WinMerge, Visual Studio, etc. So with those two set up, the other settings to be aware of is other things that can be set on this verify settings instance. So before we used the use directory method, which sets the directory for the snapshots, and there are other things that we can set on here as well. So let's take a look at the snapshot that came through before, and let's take a look at the ID property. Now you can see that it doesn't actually have the ID that was set on that user account. Instead, it says GUID_1. And likewise with the date where it says created at, it doesn't have the date, it has datetime offset 1. And what's happening here is that there are a variety of what's called scrubbers built into Verify. Now, if we were not to have those scrubbers, and in fact it did actually have the real ID that was returned and the real date that was returned, then next time we run it, won't match the verified file because of course it will have a different ID uniquely generated, and it would have a different time that it was created at, and it would fail every time. So certain things that change every time the test is run will need to be scrubbed out. So there are built-in scrubbers for things like GUIDs and dates because those are the things that are most likely to change. But another common one would be an ID that is a number. So let's take a look at an example. So over in the user account service, what I've done is I've added a new property to the user account entity, and I've just called that int ID example. So this is just a way of showing you, for example, if we weren't using a GUID as an ID, but instead we were using an int, then this would be an example of how each time we run the test, you would get a new number that won't be automatically scrubbed out by Verify. So this is just calling a random instance, and it's just going to randomly generate a new int every time we call this method to demonstrate this example. So now if I run our test, we know it's going to fail because it's not going to match the previous example. And you can see that it has highlighted that a new new property has been added. So in this case, it's randomly allocated this ID. And say this was the ID for this user, we could accept that and all would be fine. But next time I run it, it's going to be a different ID again, and it will never pass. So this is an example of what would happen if we weren't using a GUID in the ID of this user account. And many people do still use integers for IDs. So you will come across this problem, but we can add a scrubber for that. So what we can do is we can add settings.scrub member, and then you can specify a type. So the type of object that we're passing into the verify method is a user account. So I'm going to specify in here user account, and then I can do a lambda and specify what property that I want to scrub. So in this case, it's going to be the int ID example. So I'm telling it to scrub that property from the user account entity. So then when I run this, you'll see it's failed because it doesn't match the verified example. But on the left-hand side, you can now see that it says scrubbed instead of showing the actual ID. So if I accept that and then run it again, you'll see that it will now pass because it will always say scrubbed now. So that's a way that you can tell it to basically ignore a property that you know is going to change or is not important for your tests. There are lots of other methods that you can call on the settings, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at the documentation and play about and see what other things you can do. But the last thing I want to show you before we go is how you can use this for integration tests. So Verify has a whole variety of additional NuGet packages that you can install to allow it to work with other types and not just passing through, for example, a user account like this. So for example, is one for verify.http, which allows you to work with HTTP calls in and out of your application. So that's great for integration tests, but it can also help you with mocking HTTP calls, and it can also record calls that your application is making to downstream APIs, for example. So if we go over to this folder here, I've got some examples of a integration test. So in the user account controller tests, I've created a controller that calls the same method on that service that we saw before. And here I've got one that tests to ensure that we should be returning OK when we make a call to our API. So that is making a call to the API endpoint, and then it's just checking that the response status code is OK. And a bit like before, we've then got another one that checks that the first name is correct, and we've got another one that checks if the last name is correct. So now that we're dealing with HTTP calls, there's things like the status code, there's things like headers, authentication, all these other things that you would need to consider. But again, we can use snapshot testing with Verify to make this a lot simpler. So as they say, here's one I made earlier. This is an integration test using Verify snapshot testing for the same endpoint. And notice how now I only have one test. Now, before we had a test for checking the status code, we had one for checking the first name, we had one for checking the last name. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't then check other properties like the new display name that we added. So if we take a look at this test, we can see that I'm creating the account, create account command like before. I'm sending that to the endpoint like before. But just like the example I showed you, I'm now just passing that to Verify. And this time I'm passing the entire HTTP response message to Verify. And because I've got the verify.http package installed, it's able to work with that, and let's run it. So the first time I run it, it's going to fail because it doesn't know what is the correct answer. And a little bit like before, you can see on the left-hand side the information that's been brought through, but it's more than just the object now. You can see that because it's the whole HTTP response, we can see the status code is 200. We can see the headers that came back from the API, as well as the body of the message. And again, it has all of those properties on it that we looked at before. So this time it's encompassing all of those things like status codes, headers, and so on. So it's actually checking the whole response from your API, which is really important, not just to check a particular property. Headers are really important, and so is the status code. So let's say that that is our accepted version. And of course, if I run that again now, it should pass. Okay, the int ID example is changing every time, like the one we looked at before. So of course, what do we need to do? We need to add a scrubber. So let's go to the constructor. And you can see here, I've set up a few things. So I've set up the use directory for the snapshots directory, like we looked at before. I've also called the scrub inline GUIDs method. And I've also added a couple of ignore members. So this is how you would ignore something that isn't on a specific type like we looked at before. This is on a HTTP response message. So I've actually put in the name of the properties that I want it to ignore, and those are removed from the Verify. And we can also add in settings.ignore members or member. And I'm going to say int ID example, I believe it was called. So let's run that again now. Okay, so it needs to match on the casing. So let's make that lowercase and run it again. And there we are. So on the left-hand side, you can see that that is now gone. It's been ignored. So we just need to accept that as the new verified version. And then when we run it again, it will then pass. And there we go. So that's how you can use it for integration tests. And I really like it for integration tests because, as I said, it shows you the status code. It shows you HTTP headers, which are really important. And if we just quickly go over to NuGet and I type in verify dot, you'll see that there are lots of verify packages. So there's one for Playwright, for example, BUnit, clipboards, entity framework, ASP.NET. There are so many things that you can use verify for to be able to check, for example, images to ensure that the pixels are the same. So you might have a picture of your website and you want to make sure that it's the same this time. There are so many more things you can do with Verify. This is just a tip of the iceberg, but I'm hoping that you can see how useful it is. And it has really saved me and my colleagues a lot of time being able to write tests that cover far more than ever before in less time. So that's it for today's video, guys. I hope you can see how snapshot testing can be an invaluable tool to help you cover more code in less time. And if you are getting anything out of these videos, please do remember to subscribe to the channel and like this video. And if you want to keep learning with me, then why not check out this video here, or maybe this one here, and I'll see you in the next one. Go on, you know you want to click it.